The moment you point a gun at a stranger, you better be absolutely sure who that stranger is. 3 hours before the headlines, before the cameras, before a badge hit the pavement in front of City Hall, Officer Bradley Cole stood in a quiet shopping plaza just outside Arlington, Virginia, red and blue lights washing over a black SUV parked neatly between faded white lines. It was 4:17 p.m., rush hour creeping in, the air heavy with late summer humidity, the kind that sticks to your uniform and shortens your patience. Bradley had already pulled over 2 drivers that afternoon, both warnings, both routine. But something about this vehicle, about the tall black man stepping out in a tailored charcoal suit, tightened something in his chest. The man moved with calm precision, closing the door gently, hands visible, posture straight, not rushed, not nervous. To Bradley, that calm felt like defiance. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered, voice sharp, amplified by authority and assumption. A couple loading groceries paused. A teenager across the lot lifted his phone. The man complied without haste, taking 3 measured steps forward. Up close, he looked to be in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, eyes steady and observant, the kind of eyes that had seen pressure before and survived it. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, tone even, controlled, almost patient. Bradley interpreted the composure as attitude. His hand rested on his holster. He told himself he was reading body language, that he was trained for this, that hesitation kept officers alive. Yet there was no sudden movement, no raised voice, no threat. Only dignity standing under flashing lights. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Bradley snapped, louder now, aware of the growing audience, aware that once a scene begins, it demands an ending. The man slowly raised his hands to chest level, palms open, not in surrender, but in clarity. Sunlight caught a simple gold ring on his right hand, engraved with a crest Bradley didn't recognize. Up close, there were faint lines near the man's eyes, the kind carved by responsibility rather than age. "Officer," he said quietly, locking eyes with Bradley. "Do you know who you're speaking to?" It wasn't a threat. It wasn't arrogance. It was a question weighted with experience. Bradley felt a flicker of doubt, quickly buried beneath pride. Around them, engines idled, shopping carts rattled. A flag above the plaza entrance snapped in the wind. The badge on Bradley's chest felt heavy, powerful, unquestioned. He adjusted his stance, mistaking restraint for control. In that parking lot, under a wide American sky stretching miles beyond the rooftops, 2 kinds of authority faced each other, one loud and visible, the other quiet and unshaken, and neither man was about to step back. Bradley Cole held his position, shoulders squared, pulse rising beneath the weight of his vest, as the man in front of him kept his hands calmly raised, palms open to the fading Virginia sun. The flashing lights painted both of them in restless red and blue, turning an ordinary parking lot into a stage where pride and perception were about to collide. A small crowd had formed now, no more than a dozen people, standing 10, maybe 15 feet away, whispering, recording, waiting. Bradley felt their eyes like pressure against his back. Authority, once displayed, demanded certainty. "I asked you a question," he said, voice tight, determined to regain control of a moment that was slipping into something unfamiliar. The man did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He simply lowered his hands slowly to his sides once Bradley nodded that he could. The movement was deliberate, measured, disciplined. "My name is Ethan Marshall," he said. Not defensive, not afraid, just factual. The name meant nothing to Bradley. He had heard thousands of names during traffic stops. To him, this was just another interaction, another report to file, another line in a shift that would end in 3 hours. Yet there was something about the way Ethan stood. Feet planted shoulder-width apart, chin level, breathing steady, not the posture of someone cornered, but of someone accustomed to command. Bradley circled slightly, eyes scanning for signs of threat that were not there. The SUV was spotless, government issue black, but that detail barely registered through the fog of assumption. "Why are you in this area?" Bradley demanded. Ethan glanced briefly at the American flag above the plaza, then back at the officer. "I live 20 minutes from here," he replied. "I stopped to pick up a gift for my daughter." His tone softened on the last word, but his gaze remained unwavering. Bradley hesitated for half a second. "Daughter? gift. Human details that complicated the narrative he had already formed in his mind. A gust of wind swept through the lot, carrying the scent of asphalt and gasoline. In the distance, the low hum of engines approached, subtle at first, then layered, organized. Ethan seemed to notice it. Bradley did not. "Officer," Ethan said quietly, "I respect your uniform. I ask that you respect the man standing in front of you." The sentence landed heavier than a shout. Around them, phones tilted closer. Someone whispered, "Something is not right." Bradley felt the ground shift beneath his confidence, but pride tightened its grip. He adjusted his stance again, determined not to appear uncertain. The sound in the distance grew clearer now, the synchronized rhythm of multiple engines moving with purpose. Ethan did not look surprised. If anything, his calm deepened, like a storm settling before it revealed its true scale. Bradley finally heard it. He glanced over his shoulder as two dark green vehicles turned into the plaza entrance, followed by another, all moving in disciplined formation. The bystanders fell silent. In that suspended second, beneath a wide sky stretching endless and indifferent above Arlington, Bradley realized that whatever story he thought he was controlling was no longer his alone. The engines rolled closer, steady and synchronized, not hurried, not chaotic, but deliberate, the kind of movement that suggested structure and rank rather than coincidence. Officer Bradley Cole felt the shift before he understood it. Conversations in the parking lot dissolved into silence as three dark green military vehicles turned in clean formation and came to a controlled stop less than 30 yards away. Doors opened in unison. Boots met pavement with disciplined precision. No one ran. No one shouted. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who did not need to prove authority because they carried it. Bradley's grip tightened at his side, though his weapon remained lowered. His pulse was loud in his ears now, competing with the low hum of idling engines. Ethan Marshall stood exactly where he had been, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, as if this unfolding scene were not a surprise, but an inevitability. A tall officer in a neatly pressed uniform stepped forward from the lead vehicle, insignia catching the late afternoon light. He took in the flashing patrol lights, the crowd with raised phones, the tension hanging in humid Virginia air. Then his eyes landed on Ethan. In an instant, his posture sharpened further. He closed the distance. With measured steps and stopped 2 feet away, heels aligned, spine straight. He brought his hand up in a crisp salute. "Sir," he said, voice firm and clear enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. The single word cut through the air more sharply than any command Bradley had issued all afternoon. Bradley felt his certainty fracture. He glanced from the uniformed officer to Ethan, searching for a misunderstanding, for some detail he had missed. Ethan returned the salute with calm familiarity, not exaggerated, not dramatic, just practiced. The bystanders shifted, whispers rippling outward like wind across grass. Bradley's badge suddenly felt lighter, almost fragile against his chest. The officer who had saluted turned his attention to Bradley, expression professional but unyielding. "Is there an issue here, officer?" he asked evenly. Bradley opened his mouth, then closed it. The words he had rehearsed in his mind only moments earlier sounded smaller now, thinner under the weight of watching eyes. "Routine stop," he managed. "Suspicious behavior." The statement lingered in the space between them, exposed. Ethan finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying not anger but disappointment. "Officer Cole, you had every opportunity to ask before you assumed." There was no accusation in his tone, only truth. The crowd sensed it. The military personnel remained composed, forming a quiet perimeter without aggression, their presence alone redefining the balance of power in the lot. Bradley felt heat rise to his face, aware that the story he had begun with flashing lights was no longer his to control. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across concrete, blending uniforms, vehicles, and civilians into one shared moment of reckoning. In that silence, Bradley understood something he had never been trained to confront. Authority does not come from volume or posture or a raised voice. Real authority stands still and lets the world adjust around it. And in that parking lot in Arlington, under a sky that had witnessed countless salutes before this one, the definition of power had just changed. The salute lingered in the air like a line drawn in ink that could not be erased. Officer Bradley Cole felt every pair of eyes in the parking lot settle on him, not with anger, not even with accusation, but with expectation. The military officer who had spoken stood calm and steady, waiting. Ethan Marshall lowered his hand from the salute and faced Bradley fully now, not as a suspect, not as a bystander, but as a man accustomed to responsibility measured in lives and miles rather than parking spaces and citations. The late afternoon light softened, stretching long shadows across the asphalt, and for the first time since the patrol lights had begun flashing, Bradley became aware of how small the scene truly was. 30 yards of concrete, a handful of witnesses, a moment that would not disappear. Officer Cole, the uniformed officer said evenly, General Marshall is expected at the Pentagon in less than 40 minutes. The word general settled heavily between them. It explained the posture, the composure, the question that had not been a threat, but a warning wrapped in patience. Bradley swallowed, the dry air catching in his throat. He had been trained to read danger, to assert command, to maintain control. He had not been trained to confront bias when it quietly guided his judgment. Ethan's voice remained calm, almost reflective. Authority is not about who raises their voice first, he said. It is about who carries responsibility when the noise fades. No one interrupted. Even the engines of the military vehicles seemed quieter now, idling like distant thunder that had chosen not to strike. Bradley glanced at the small crowd. Phones were still raised. The red and blue lights continued to rotate, but their urgency felt misplaced, theatrical against the disciplined stillness of the soldiers who had formed a respectful perimeter. A realization moved through him, slow and uncomfortable. He had escalated a routine moment, because something about this man's presence challenged his assumptions. The tailored suit, the calm confidence, the refusal to appear intimidated. Bradley had mistaken dignity for defiance. The uniformed officer stepped slightly closer, his tone professional but firm. We will take it from here. It was not a reprimand. It was a transfer of control. Bradley nodded, the motion stiff. He reached up and switched off his patrol lights. The sudden absence of red and blue left the scene washed only in natural light, honest and unfiltered. Ethan adjusted his jacket, smoothing the fabric with a measured gesture. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction, only a quiet gravity. We all serve the same flag, he said softly, glancing once more at the American banner moving gently above the plaza entrance. The question is how we choose to honor it. The words did not echo loudly, but they carried farther than any shouted command. Around them, the tension dissolved into something heavier than relief. Reflection. Bradley stood still, badge resting against his chest, understanding dawning not through force but through contrast. Real power had arrived without chaos. Real authority had spoken without threat. And in that unremarkable stretch of Virginia pavement, beneath a sky stretching endless and impartial, a lesson had been delivered without a single act of violence, only the undeniable weight of truth. The parking lot slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, but nothing about the moment felt ordinary anymore. The military vehicles remained in quiet formation, their presence steady and restrained, while curious onlookers began lowering their phones, whispering to one another as if they had just witnessed something larger than a traffic stop. Officer Bradley Cole stood a few steps back from Ethan Marshall now, the space between them no longer defined by suspicion but by realization. The flashing patrol lights were off, leaving only the soft glow of the descending sun reflecting against windshields and storefront glass. Bradley felt the weight of his earlier certainty pressing against his ribs. It was not fear. It was awareness, the kind that arrives when pride has nowhere left to hide. Ethan glanced at his watch, a simple stainless steel piece worn with practicality rather than display. I have a briefing in 30 minutes, he said calmly to the uniformed officer beside him. We will not delay it. There was no irritation in his voice, only focus. Responsibility did not pause for personal offense. The officer nodded respectfully and stepped aside. Bradley cleared his throat, the sound dry in the warm air. Words formed slowly, heavier than any command he had issued that afternoon. General Marshall, he began, forcing himself to meet Ethan's eyes. I misjudged this situation. The sentence did not come easily. It moved through layers of training, ego, and assumption before it reached daylight. Ethan studied him for a moment that felt longer than it was. Around them, engines idled patiently, soldiers waiting without impatience, because discipline meant understanding that leadership often revealed itself in uncomfortable seconds like these. "Officer Cole," Ethan replied, voice steady and composed. "Every decision you make carries weight beyond the moment you make it." He paused, allowing the words to settle. "You represent more than yourself when you wear that badge." Bradley nodded slowly. The statement was simple, direct, undeniable. A breeze swept across the asphalt, cooler now as the sun dipped lower, lifting the corner of a nearby American flag. Bradley followed Ethan's gaze toward it. For years, he had believed authority meant control, volume, immediate compliance. But standing there, watching a man who commanded thousands remain calm under flashing lights and public scrutiny, he began to understand a different definition. Authority was steadiness under pressure. It was restraint when ego demanded reaction. It was dignity that did not need validation. Ethan extended his hand, not in triumph, not in forgiveness fully granted, but in acknowledgement. Bradley hesitated only a fraction of a second before shaking it. The gesture was firm and brief, witnessed by soldiers and civilians alike. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Just a quiet recalibration of respect. Ethan stepped back toward the waiting vehicles, posture unchanged, presence undiminished. As he moved, the formation adjusted smoothly around him, doors opening with practiced timing. Bradley remained where he was, watching as the convoy prepared to depart. He understood now that the lesson delivered that afternoon had not required force. It had required contrast. One man had tried to assert power. The other had embodied it. And in the stillness that followed, beneath a wide Virginia sky turning gold at the horizon, Officer Bradley Cole realized that true authority does not announce itself with flashing lights. It reveals itself in how a man stands when challenged and how he chooses to rise when corrected. The convoy doors closed with muted precision, engines rising in a controlled hum as the vehicles prepared to pull away, and Officer Bradley Cole remained rooted to the asphalt, watching the reflection of the late afternoon sun slide across polished metal and tinted windows. No sirens sounded. No dramatic exit. Just disciplined motion, steady and deliberate, as if the world itself had shifted gears without asking permission. Ethan Marshall stepped into the lead vehicle without looking back immediately, his posture unchanged, his composure intact, carrying with him not resentment, but responsibility. The formation moved out smoothly, turning toward the main road that led in the direction of the Pentagon, less than 15 miles away, where decisions affecting thousands would be made before sunset. The parking lot felt strangely quiet once the convoy disappeared beyond the traffic light. Civilian cars resumed their routines. Shopping carts rolled again. Conversations restarted in softer tones. Yet Bradley knew that something irreversible had occurred. The teenager who had been recording lowered his phone slowly, glancing at Bradley with a look that was not mocking, not hostile, but questioning. It was the kind of look that forces a man to examine himself long after witnesses leave. Bradley exhaled slowly, feeling the humidity cling to his uniform, the fabric suddenly heavier against his shoulders. He reached up and adjusted his badge, tracing its edge with his thumb as if confirming that it was still there, still earned, still deserved. The handshake lingered in his mind. Firm, brief, unembellished. It had not been forgiveness freely given. It had been accountability acknowledged. He replayed the moment when he had first seen Ethan step from the SUV. The tailored suit, the calm eyes, the measured tone. None of those details had indicated threat, yet something inside him had reacted anyway. Training had taught him to assess risk. Experience had taught him to assert control. But no manual had ever instructed him to confront the quiet influence of bias. A patrol unit drove past at low speed, another officer offering a subtle nod of acknowledgement. Bradley returned it automatically, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The American flag above the plaza continued to move gently in the evening breeze, indifferent to rank, uniform, or ego. It stood for something larger than any single badge or title. Bradley understood now that wearing a uniform did not shield a man from reflection. It demanded it. He walked back toward his cruiser, each step slower than the ones that had carried him into the confrontation. The sunlight dipped lower, casting the sky in shades of amber and steel blue, stretching long shadows across the pavement where two forms of authority had faced each other minutes earlier. He opened the driver's door, but did not get in immediately. Instead, he looked out across the nearly empty lot and allowed the lesson to settle without resistance. Power used without awareness becomes noise. Authority carried with discipline becomes example. As he finally slid into the seat and closed the door, the silence inside the cruiser felt different than before. Not defeated, not humiliated, changed. And somewhere down the highway, heading toward a building built of stone and history, a general prepared for a briefing that would shape the future, unaware that in a small Virginia parking lot, another man had just begun confronting his own. The cruiser engine turned over with a low vibration that Bradley Cole felt through the steering wheel, steady and familiar, yet the familiarity no longer brought comfort. He sat there for several seconds without pulling out, watching the empty stretch of asphalt where everything had shifted less than 20 minutes earlier. The sky above Arlington had deepened into a blend of copper and blue, the kind of evening that usually signaled the final hours of a routine shift. But routine no longer applied. His radio crackled softly with distant dispatch chatter, other officers responding to calls measured in addresses and report numbers, unaware that in this quiet parking lot a different kind of call had been answered. Bradley adjusted his rearview mirror and caught his own reflection. Same uniform, same badge, same man. Yet something behind his eyes had changed. He replayed Ethan Marshall's voice in his mind, calm and unwavering. Every decision you make carries weight beyond the moment you make it. The words were not loud, yet they pressed harder than any reprimand could have. Bradley shifted the cruiser into drive and rolled slowly toward the exit, passing beneath the American flag that continued to move gently in the evening breeze. He stopped at the light, red against the fading sky, and allowed himself to breathe deeply for the first time all afternoon. Training had always emphasized control of the scene, but no academy lesson had fully explained control of self. As he merged onto the road, traffic flowing at 45 miles per hour, he noticed details he would normally ignore. A father holding his daughter's hand at a crosswalk. A delivery driver unloading boxes with quiet focus. Lives intersecting briefly with his patrol route, trusting that the uniform approaching them carried fairness, not assumption. The realization settled with uncomfortable clarity. Authority granted by a badge could open doors or close them. It could calm fear or create it. The difference lived not in policy manuals, but in the heart of the person wearing it. Bradley turned onto a side street and parked for a moment beneath a row of maple trees just beginning to hint at autumn. The world outside continued undisturbed, yet inside the cruiser, reflection grew heavier. He thought about the calm in Ethan's eyes, the discipline in the soldier's movements, the absence of anger even when dignity had been tested. That restraint had not come from weakness. It had come from strength shaped by responsibility. Bradley understood now that respect is not demanded at the volume of a command. It is earned in the quiet space between action and reaction. His radio crackled again, calling him back to duty, another routine request for assistance less than 2 miles away. He reached for the microphone, voice steady, responding with the same professionalism he always had. But beneath the steady tone was a renewed awareness, a commitment forming without announcement. The badge on his chest did not change that evening. The streets did not change. The sky did not shift course. Yet something inside him had recalibrated. Because sometimes the most powerful correction does not arrive with punishment or spectacle. It arrives in a single moment of contrast, when a man realizes that true authority is measured not by how quickly he asserts control, but by how wisely he chooses to use it. The call 2 miles away turned out to be minor, a stalled sedan blocking part of a narrow side street, a tired mother with 2 children in the back seat waiting anxiously for help. Officer Bradley Cole parked behind the vehicle, activated his hazard lights without urgency, and stepped out into the cooling Virginia evening. The air felt different now, lighter against his skin, as if the weight he carried earlier had shifted inward rather than outward. The mother explained that her engine had simply given up without warning. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear of him, but from the stress of being stranded as daylight faded. Bradley listened without interrupting. Truly listened. He noticed the little boy in the back seat clutching a plastic action figure, watching him carefully through the window. That gaze lingered longer than expected. Children see more than adults assume. Bradley offered reassurance in a calm tone, called for roadside assistance, and helped guide the vehicle safely to the shoulder. No raised voice. No sharp commands. Just steady presence. As the tow truck arrived 15 minutes later, the mother thanked him with visible relief. The boy gave a small wave before the truck pulled away. Bradley stood there for a moment after the street grew quiet again, reflecting on how simple the interaction had been, how easily authority could feel like service rather than dominance. He returned to his cruiser and glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Just over an hour had passed since the parking lot. Yet the distance between who he had been and who he felt himself becoming seemed greater than miles. He thought again about General Ethan Marshall heading toward the Pentagon, likely already seated in a briefing room lined with maps and screens, making decisions that required composure under far greater pressure than a traffic stop. That composure had not been rehearsed for show. It had been earned through years of discipline and accountability. Bradley began to understand that discipline was not only for soldiers. It was for anyone trusted with power. The radio remained quiet for a few minutes, giving him space to sit with the evening. Streetlights flickered on one by one along the road, casting soft pools of yellow across sidewalks and storefronts. Each light illuminated ordinary people going about ordinary lives. People who would never know his name, but who would remember how he made them feel in brief encounters measured in minutes. He adjusted his posture in the driver's seat, not out of stiffness, but intention. The badge on his chest did not need to shine brighter. It needed to stand for something steadier. He pulled back onto the road, merging into traffic flowing at a steady 40 miles per hour, headlights stretching ahead like quiet promises. Authority, he realized, is not proven in confrontation. It is proven in consistency, in patience, in the choice to pause before assuming. And as the night settled over Arlington, Officer Bradley Cole carried that realization forward, not as a burden, but as a responsibility that would define every stop yet to come. Night settled fully over Arlington, and the city lights reflected off the windshield of Officer Bradley Cole's cruiser as he completed his final patrol route of the shift. The streets moved with quiet purpose, headlights flowing in steady lines, storefront signs glowing against the dark like watchful eyes. Everything looked the same as it had that afternoon, yet Bradley felt the difference in every breath he took. He drove past the shopping plaza once more, not out of obligation, but reflection. The parking lot was nearly empty now, only a few scattered cars resting beneath tall light poles. No flashing lights, no gathered crowd, just still pavement holding the memory of a moment that had quietly reshaped him. He slowed as he passed, glancing toward the exact spot where he had first stepped out with certainty and assumption. The scene replayed in his mind, but this time he saw it differently. Not as a confrontation, not as a challenge to authority, but as a mirror. He understood now that power is tested not when it is obeyed, but when it is questioned. And character is revealed not when a man is in control, but when control begins to slip. Across town, inside a secured conference room at the Pentagon, General Ethan Marshall concluded a briefing that carried consequences far beyond one afternoon. Charts were reviewed. Strategies were discussed. Decisions were weighed carefully, measured in impact rather than ego. Yet for a brief second between agenda items, even he allowed his thoughts to drift back to the parking lot. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with resolve. Because leadership meant recognizing that the lesson was not just for one officer. It was for a system, for a culture, for every uniform that carried trust stitched into its seams. Back in his cruiser, Bradley parked outside the station, engine idling softly before he turned the key and let silence settle around him. He removed his hands from the steering wheel slowly, studying them in the dim interior light. The same hands that had reached for authority without pause now rested with intention. He stepped out into the cool night air, looking up at the American flag illuminated above the station entrance. It moved gently against the dark sky, unchanged and unwavering. Bradley realized that wearing a badge did not make him the law. It made him a steward of it. And stewardship required humility. As he walked inside to file his final report, his steps were steady, not heavy. He did not feel diminished. He felt awakened. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet correction under open sky, teaching a man that the uniform he wears is not a shield for pride, but a promise of fairness. He thought he understood authority when he stepped into that parking lot. But that day, authority stood calmly in front of him and showed him what it truly meant. And from that night forward, every decision he made carried the echo of that lesson, reminding him that real power does not demand respect. It earns it in silence.